Global Conservation Corps presents the Rhino Man podcast. I'm John Jerko, your host, and one of the directors of Rhino Man the movie. This podcast series is a way for me to interview top conservationists on the topics of rhinos, the poaching crisis, the importance of rangers, and community engagement, all as a way to create awareness around these issues and to promote the coming release of our documentary film. In this episode, I'm talking with Jamie McCallum. Jamie spent 10 years in corporate sponsorship, working with Orange, Toyota, Omega, Usain Bolt, and Ferrari, before getting a PhD in biological sciences and doing research on the US-Mexico border. He then set up and ran the technology program at the Zoological Society of London, and since 2015, he's been the UK-EU Director of Peace Parks Foundation. Jamie is the founder and CEO of Force for Nature, a forward-thinking social and environmental enterprise committed to preserving nature and the value it brings to humanity by supporting wildlife rangers. In this conversation, we talk about Jamie's youth growing up in the UK with horses, his early professional career working with corporate sponsors for Formula One racing, and his eventual journey into conservation. We go into the importance of rangers and the support they need. We dive into the creation of Force for Nature, the Ranger app, and the Pod app, which is used for amplifying campaigns to help bring awareness and funds to rangers. We also explore new models for NGOs to work with corporate sponsors. This conversation is full of great stories, a love for rangers, and innovative solutions to support their work. So let's jump in. All right, welcome to the show, Jamie. So glad to have you on the Rhino Man podcast.
Thank you very much, John. It's a great pleasure to be here.
So let's just start off with what is Force for Nature and what is your role there? Because I think we're going to talk a lot about that as we go through this conversation.
Yeah, so Force for Nature is a social enterprise that I started a couple of years ago. And the focus really is to fill the gap in capacity, in particular training, equipment, and welfare for wildlife rangers or park rangers, as some people call them, on a global basis, and not just in Africa, but on a global basis. And really, we aim to do that because we know that 3/4 of protected areas in and around the world are ineffectively managed. Mm-hmm. And one of the big gaps in that creates that ineffective management is the provision of equipment, training, and welfare for rangers. And that's the challenge we mean to address. And I'm the founder and chief executive, but I have a great team around me who do most of the really tough stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it's going to be really awesome to dive into the details of what you guys are doing. But before we get too far into that, can we just take a step back and, where did you grow up? How did you get connected to conservation? Were there any early stories to get you off on this journey?
Yeah, so I grew up in the southwest of England in the Cotswolds, which is an area of outstanding natural beauty. It's a really striking kind of quintessentially English, bucolic part of the world and lifestyle. And I grew up surrounded by, farms and forests and trees and all these natural wonders. And so I was kind of integrated into that world from a very young age, and we had horses and all that type of thing. So from that point of view, I was really dealing with the wonders of nature, but also I found this particular affinity with horses. And I think they're a really good cipher or a really good vector for connecting us with nature, because they are 30 times more powerful than us, physically speaking, but they are 30 times more gentle and have this extraordinary capacity for empathy and to reflect human behaviors and feelings. And they're extraordinary mirrors on our own inner world. So that was the sort of kickoff. But this was sort of buried deep within me. And I traveled a lot as a kid and lived in different parts of the world. And then crazily, really, my first job after college was working in motorsports, sports and motorsports. And I worked in Formula One motor racing. And because at that time, I didn't really think there was a particularly obvious path into conservation. It wasn't such a big thing, it wasn't, and the career paths weren't so evident.
Was it something that you had in the back of your mind, though, as, if you could find a way, you would?
Yeah, absolutely. It was very much in my mind, but I couldn't see an obvious route. And I didn't do biology at college, so it was less time. But what was fascinating about the motorsport game was, I worked in the top Formula One team called Williams at the time, and I worked with a top driver called Damon Hill, who won the World Championship in 1996. And what was so fascinating was that I noticed really early on that hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars were going into the sport in sponsorship every year. Corporate partners were investing in hospitality and branding in Formula One. And I noticed that the boss of the Williams Formula One team, Sir Frank Williams, who's recently died, I noticed that his passion was for motorsport above all else. And he used this thing called corporate partnerships and sponsorship to fund his passion. And he, went to the very top of the game. And so I started thinking really early on, hey, as I learned about sponsoring, oh God, maybe we could use this same platform to deliver value to corporates and deliver a lot more money into conservation. That was the sort of seed that grew and germinated and grew in my mind over a decade, really, as I worked in sport.
Yeah. When you were with the Formula One team, were you in kind of that department that was working with developing these sponsorships, or what was your capacity?
Good question. You're absolutely right. Yes, I was the guy either finding sponsors or looking after sponsors. And so I did that for a long time. I worked with, big global brands. And so, it gave me a fantastic insight into how that game worked. And I became more and more convinced that it could be applied to conservation. And so I did some early kind of experiments, and we had some really good early successes, in fact. And I worked with Toyota Motor Corporation in Japan for a number of years, and they invested in a long-running TV show which they sponsored, which is a nature-based TV show, which we made and had distributed in 140 countries around the world. It was a huge success over 6-7 years, and with big audiences. And so, but because then the dot-com crash came, and again, a little bit like I think we discussed earlier, I mean, with COVID, there's sort of everybody consolidated. So their investment into more ambitious and interesting things waned, and everyone went back to sponsoring football and the like. Still, the idea was within me. And around that time, I went back to university because I realized I did need a deeper biological knowledge. So I went back to university and I did a PhD in biology, particularly looking at protected area management. And so that was like a massive change coming from the high-tech, global, glamorous, in inverted commas, world of Formula One into, working in protected areas around the world. I did a lot on the US-Mexico border, in fact.
Yeah, well, I just curious, what made you decide to go get a PhD? I feel like that's a lot of work to familiarize yourself with conservation, and there's probably other ways you could have gone about it, but what attracted you to that path?
Well, so one was that I think at the time I did it, unlike the 15 years earlier, conservation was much more of a well-publicized path. And as a result, and because people, as we've got more concerned about the environment, rightly so, more and more people have been attracted to working in that industry so they can help fix the problems we face. But a lot of people were doing master's degrees. And so I thought, I'm later on in my career. I've had 16 years into my career, and I need to catapult myself ahead of the game here. And if I'm really serious about bringing this innovative new approach to funding to conservation, then I need to be like an expert in conservation and in marketing. So that was one reason. But I think it's about having the in-depth knowledge, but it's also about the credibility. If I'm trying to do something different and new, you need to be doubly credible, and because otherwise people won't follow you. They'll think you're just a crackpot or someone trying their arm or chancing their arm. So that's probably why.
No, that makes sense. I mean, maybe even subconsciously we're kind of influenced by our experience with sponsorships and working with people on the marketing side. That's like you saw how you had to market yourself to these people you were going to potentially go after to make a difference. So
yeah, that's a good insight.
It makes sense.
That's a good insight. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
So from there, you said you went and you did some work on the US-Mexico border. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so it was a really, really exciting time, and I absolutely loved it because it was a million miles in every sense from what I'd previously done. But I was working in Arizona in 4 protected areas in Arizona and on the border. And we put cameras along the border, which were measuring the movement of wildlife in both directions from Sonora and Mexico into Arizona. And we were comparing the movement of those wildlife in areas where there was no border wall with areas where there was a border wall. And so I spent a lot of time carrying heavy packs full of cameras and, hiding them in trees and bushes and rocks and things. And it was just fantastic. I had an incredible time, and I learned a huge amount. But it was particularly fascinating because what we learned in a scientific sense was that where there was a border wall, there was just no difference between the frequency of humans, migrants, and smugglers where there was a border wall and where there wasn't a border wall. So in other words, the wall didn't seem, in that zone at least, but we had it over 4 different protected areas which were over 200 miles apart. It wasn't just a localized effect, it was a statewide effect. So there was no effect there, but there was huge discrepancy to a scientifically significant degree of species. So, for example, mountain lion were almost non-existent in areas where there was a wall. And because they're cryptic and they're quite sensitive to some of these things, so these effects. Whereas the further you moved away from the wall end, the more of them there were. And even small things like coatimundi were really affected to a significant, mathematically significant degree. But things like bobcat and coyote, they were fine. I mean, they're generalists, so they could easily adapt to all these different conditions. But it was fantastic, pretty hair-raising at times. We definitely I had some encounters with some bad dudes, and I had some encounters with some desperate dudes. And we learned a lot scientifically, but it was a real eye-opener because I also spent a lot of time with the rangers. So in some of the more dangerous areas where I wanted to put my cameras, I had to be escorted by park rangers who were fantastic and really supportive of the work we were doing. And, I sort of developed a real respect for the work they were doing because most of them joined up in order to protect nature and wildlife. And a lot of them were they were all heavily armed. They weren't just carrying a sidearm. They were heavily armed to protect themselves from drug smugglers. In fact, in Organ Pike National Monument, where I worked for a bit, where I had some of our cameras, a ranger was killed a couple of years before I was working there. It was pretty sobering to realize the importance and the difficulties and challenges of the work that these guys face.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of things there. I mean, it's kind of interesting that I feel like in the last, 5 or 6 years here in the US, the wall was a pretty big debate. And I feel like I've never really heard any of those studies, which, simultaneously shows that it's ineffective for what its purpose. And then it's also doing a lot of damage ecologically, which seems like a pretty important thing to know about. And then on the other side, the rangers, I mean, so was this kind of your first real connection to rangers and where maybe you started to get this bug of like, this is kind of the direction I might want to go in terms of what I want to do personally with conservation?
Yeah, I think certainly was around protect area. So yeah, the first thing, that's your first point. Yeah, I mean, in scientific terms, in the area where you studied, almost the worst of all worlds. I mean, it didn't, as you say, it didn't do the job it was meant to do, but it did harm elsewhere. I mean, that's not a good outcome, especially given the cost. And at the time, I did have we published some papers, peer-reviewed papers, and we had some interviews in the TV, and it was publicized a bit for a while. And then a president and a half later, the subject came up again, and a couple of people sort of picked up on the paper. But you're right, it was never a sort of widespread. There are several other papers which have come to the same conclusion in different areas. Mm-hmm. And then about rangers, I'm not sure I initially, apart from having a strong respect for the work they did and the obstacles they faced, I don't think I realized that rangers were of particular importance at that moment. I mean, I think it was a moment in the PhD when I saw that some of the surveys and studies we did showed that the more infrastructure you put in place, we did a pan Latin America and North America study, and that showed a rather similar effect, that actually the more cooperation, the more human training and capacity you built and cooperation between different agencies you had, that was actually a much better indicator of success in terms of law enforcement and species protection than putting in, lots of infrastructure. I mean, infrastructure is static by its nature. So the trouble with static infrastructure is it's easy to go over it, under it, round it, through it, whatever you want. I mean, I even saw, guys, I didn't see this live, but I've seen a video of guys cutting a hole in the wall and putting hinges on, and then when the border patrol go past, they all sort of chop through and then shut the little gate, and then it's all run off. So, it's a very hard, static defenses are really, really tough. So I had this respect and interest, but I don't think I'd put the full piece of the puzzle together at that stage.
So after that, you went back to the UK, is that correct?
So I came back to the UK at that point, and I started working quite quickly inside conservation NGOs. I worked for the Zoological Society of London, and I was fortunate enough to be asked to set up their conservation technology department. And this was fantastic because we'd used some pretty innovative stuff with our cameras in the US. And so we were building satellite-connected, AI-driven camera solutions for anti-poaching across the world. And it was fantastic. We had great partners such as Google and Microsoft Research and Iridium Satellite. It was a really interesting time because I was able to sort of test out that model of, how can corporates work with the conservation sector to deliver value in this area. And so that was a really exciting time because, we found we could, and it was a huge amount of collaboration across the board. And so we delivered these first of a kind cameras to rangers, and we trained them in Kenya and in Nepal in particular, and they're still being used now.
Was most of that collaboration with the technology companies themselves, the people that were building this stuff, or?
Exactly, but it was like it was an R&D project followed by a manufacturing project, followed by a delivery project, and so the combination of those things, it's quite innovative. It was quite innovative in conservation, because working with big companies, not just to receive money, but actually a win-win where everybody is getting something out of the partnership, and everyone's learning something from each other in the partnership. So that was a really valuable process. I think it taught me about some of the cultural differences between NGOs and corporates, and how you might bridge some of those. But again, it brought me into really deep contact with rangers in a whole stack of ways, because we were working with rangers and we were listening to their needs, and we were trying to understand how these cameras might assist them, and whether the technological complexity of these things meant that they could never be maintained once they'd been left behind. And I learned huge amounts about kit being dropped in protected areas all over the world and being sort of, left and then not used, or breaking and never being maintained. And so all of those times, I tried to understand what rangers really needed in different parts of the world, whether it was actually just straightforward, good, robust outdoor clothing, or whether it's high-tech equipment. And of course it varies. But I spent a lot of time with rangers, and there's a really good story about rangers in Kenya. And we were working with these guys in Kenya from Kenya Wildlife Service, and we were talking to them about these cameras and trying to work with them to deploy them effectively. After one particularly hot day, we all sort of sat down and we had a beer, and we were just talking casually about sport and soccer and stuff. And turns out that one of these guys was a really good 400-meter runner. And we were like, oh, wow, that's there's a squad of about 12 guys. And we're like, they're really good. And he said, I was in the Commonwealth Games that I ran a 43-second 400 or whatever. We're like, wow, God, that's amazing. And then another guy sort of chirped up from the other time. Yeah, no, I was in the Nairobi Marathon, and I came, fourth in the Nairobi Marathon in 2 hours, 8 minutes. And I go, what? God, that's incredible. And then and about 3 or 4 other guys had these amazing stories about these incredible athletic endeavors. And then we said, well, how come, such a small sample of people have all these? And they said, well, during their training, the selection to become rangers, they went through all the sort of academic tests and did little interviews and stuff, and sort of basic physical stuff. But there's the final test. There's still 100 people, and they only needed 50. So the instructors said, right, everybody run around that mountain, and the first 50 back, you're in. So it was like, wow, well, that explains why they were such incredible athletes. But notwithstanding that, I think that indicates other things about the challenges, of the personal challenges. A lot of people, these rangers were a long way from home and spent a long time away from home as well. But they were fantastic guys working in an amazing place, again, with commitment and bravery and knowledge. And I think that's another, that's the next sort of layer on top of what I'd seen in the US. And there was a similar sort of experience with rangers in Nepal as well, when we took these cameras. So it was a really eye-opening experience.
So what was kind of the genesis of Force for Nature? How did that idea come about, and what made you want to take that leap into it?
Well, after the zoological study, I spent and still advise Peace Parks Foundation, who are based in Southern Africa. And they're a really fantastic organization, and they do large landscape restoration and rewilding projects, and integrated with local communities. And they were set up in part by one of the founders was Nelson Mandela. So they're, in my opinion, one of the best conservation agencies out there, just in terms of professionalism and delivery on the ground. So I've sort of been advising them for now, and I sort of saw how things could be done really, really well. And I really enjoy and continue to enjoy working with them. But they also had been addressing some of the technological solutions for counter-poaching operations, which they were very effective with. And so I sort of spent a while with them, but I saw that even a really well-run organization like Peace Parks Foundation, who operate under quite a strict and strategic plan, in quite a strict geographical area, just Southern Africa, were still only able, but I don't mean to underestimate how challenging. I mean, I say it was strict because they realized the scale of the challenges even in those, controlled circumstances. And yet, but even for them, raising funds to do a really major job was, even though they're turning over a lot more money than most people in that region, and still it was a challenge for them. And at the same time, I saw the development of all these different protected areas, which is, and the training of rangers, which is connected to the Southern African Wildlife College down there, which Mm-hmm. And of course, these things added the extra layer of kind of knowledge onto my brow. So I thought, now is the time I've actually got to try and bring to life this vision that I'd had all those years earlier, and try to solve some of these funding and capacity issues. And I think there was this final piece of the puzzle was when I stumbled across a piece of research which showed that 76% of protected areas around the world are not effectively managed. And it just seemed outrageous that we're striving to cover 30% of the planet to be protected by 2030. And yet what we have today, 17% of the terrestrial area and 7% of the oceans is not effectively managed. So we should really focus on that first, because otherwise it's a squandered opportunity. And then alongside that, I saw the research that came out of the, Life on the Frontline research that shows that, rangers in so many areas are inadequately supported. And those things seem to fit to me really, really well together. I mean, they're not a perfect fit, but there's a very strong correlation. And so that was the sort of genesis of it. So 2 years ago, I set up Force for Nature in conjunction with some great partners. And, I can talk about that in a bit more detail. But that was the sort of moment when I just went, okay, we're ready. I've had experience in conservation. I've got the academic background and I've got the marketing, and the problems are getting greater to the point where you can't delay any longer.
I'm just curious, was this just before or just after the pandemic started? Because that probably
good question.
weighed on everyone's conscience.
Yeah, it was just before. It was just before. So it was probably, 6-8 months before the pandemic. We set ourselves up.
Was it just before that World Ranger Congress in 2019? Did you guys start then? Or?
Yeah, exactly. So we started so it went down. That was the sort of the trigger, and probably 6 months before that, we had the idea. And then we set up with a fantastic purpose-led advertising agency or creative and design agency in London called Revolt London. And they lead on some incredible global campaigns for brands and in both the social and environmental sector. And so together we came up with the brand and the idea of them bringing all that creative stuff and me bringing the kind of conservation need in. And then very quickly, we identified the gap that if there are 300,000 protected and conserved areas in the world, and 17,000 that are over 100 square kilometers, and 4,000 that are over 1,000 square kilometers. I mean, these are, of course, massive spaces. So how on earth do you deliver capacity support in all these places? Well, the answer is, technology. So we built the Ranger app with some Dutch partners called Ortec, and they've been fantastic supporters as well. So we built the platform with them, and we've grown it to several thousand rangers in 105 countries using the platform. And I can talk a bit more about that in a sec. But yeah, so it's sort of accelerated very fast. But the launch of that app was at the World Ranger Congress in Nepal. And that was a pretty exciting moment. And mainly it wasn't just the blind launch of it. We did a lot of listening. So we had questionnaire surveys, and we were gathering as much as we could from rangers to try and understand what needs were, rather than, that sort of top down. And that's a really key part of our philosophy, is really that it's all about bottom up. It's a platform by rangers for rangers, or for rangers by rangers, rather than some top down entity. It's a facilitator as much as anything else.
Yeah. Can you talk a little bit about that experience at the World Ranger Congress? Have you been to one before that? Was that your first? And what was it like being around rangers from all around the world?
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that. It's a pleasure to talk about. I mean, it was the first one I've been to, and it was pretty illuminating, captivating, exciting. I think as much as anything else, the sense of camaraderie between rangers from every corner of the globe, and this sort of buzz of chatter, excitement, and overlapping interest was just remarkable. And it was just great fun, apart from anything else. But it was also really reassuring, because you're like, okay, well, building a community of rangers on a tech platform is something that people want. People want to be connected. And then when we talked about the amount of people who said, we want to do exchanges. Can you facilitate exchanges? And it just shows that. So that interconnectivity piece, I thought, was really, really striking. So yeah, that's my assessment of it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was the first time I had been to one as well, and just, I mean, the experience of meeting all those people. I mean, they did a great job of just being able to have game drives in Chitwan National Park, which is a beautiful place to be. So
Yeah.
it was a amazing experience all around.
Yes, well, it was my first exposure to your excellent film as well, in an earlier iteration of it, but it was, yeah, absolutely brilliant.
Oh yeah, thank you. Yeah, that's come a long way. Appreciate that. Maybe a good way to lead into the Ranger app is to dive in a little bit more to what Rangers are and what their needs are. I mean, you kind of have like hit on little points here and there, but
Yeah.
for someone that maybe this is their first episode listening in, could you give, from your perspective, what is a Ranger? Especially if you're trying to tackle it from a global scale. Our story is very South African, that context, people in the US might kind of understand what a game warden is or a park ranger is, but what are you trying to do with this app in terms of rangers from all over the world? What kind of things are they doing? What are their challenges? I feel like that's probably a podcast in itself,
Yeah.
but the best you can kind of sum up some of those key points.
Well, I think a lot of the motivation and the clarity we have on addressing this problem is from the Life on the Frontline report and subsequent other reports about the status of rangers, which fed into the Chitwan Declaration from Nepal, which talked about the importance of rangers and the challenges they face, and then that led into a global ranger action plan by the Ranger Support Alliance. The core of those things are stats like 30% of rangers do not have sufficient training. 86% have first aid training less than once a year. 50% don't have fresh water on patrol. 50% have unsuitable equipment, and the list goes on under all of those. And yet, these are the people who we're expecting to protect nearly 20% of our planet, and which provides ecosystem services, obviously like clean air, fresh water, pollination services. And really, even COVID we talked about earlier. I mean, it's the rangers are the first line of defense against zoonotic disease. So they've got these critical roles, which the life support system of the planet and human society depends upon. And yet they have this extraordinarily inadequate levels of support. Not everywhere, of course, but in a lot of the world they do. So that's the injustice in many ways that we want to address.
Yeah. And so the development of this Ranger app is a way to maybe kind of go into some of the details, connect rangers, build support for them.
Yeah, exactly. So there are a number of different categories in the Ranger app. So the first one is that a generic news section. So we bring biodiversity news and conservation news from around the world, which is supplied so they can sort of keep up to date with what's happening globally. And there's a sort of prioritized section in that news bit, which sort of tells you about stories that might be more relevant to you. So geographical relevance and or things that are relevant to you, the habitat in which you work or the species with which you work, or indeed the ranger association that you belong to. And then alongside that, there's a channel for stories. So rangers can tell their own stories. And I talked earlier on about making things bottom up and giving rangers a voice as well. So rangers from at any level at which they operate are able to share stories, a photograph and a line or two about what they're up to and where they're doing it. And it's fantastic. The stories we've had thousands of posts from all over the world and lots of collaboration and people talking about migratory species moving from one country to another and rangers sharing information on that, or wildfire information being shared between Australia and parts of Africa. So we have this kind of really good collaborative approach there. And then we have a directory of rangers and we have a ranger calendar. So rangers can, and their organizations can feed information into this so that, again, helping rangers to be a part of this global community and understanding that there are other events all over the world happening, which connecting rangers. And then there's a learning platform, which is obviously a really critical part of the offering. And that provides a stack of training programs which are accredited and have been issued by approved conservation entities. So that's a really important part of what we do. But we'd also like to think the platform in time will become an opportunity for generating funding for protected areas and rangers, and alongside other benefits such as reduced prices for equipment and things. So there's a whole different array of things that we want to do and we can do with the platform, but data collection is also one of them. So it's a really exciting opportunity, we believe, to deliver some of the things that rangers are missing because of which have been highlighted in the State of the Ranger report, Life on the Frontline.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just kind of going back to you're talking about the design and the branding and everything. I mean, it's a beautiful site, a beautiful app. It's really well done. I feel like, a lot of a lot of things in this space can be just kind of hacked together, I mean, no fault to people involved. It's hard sometimes to get the resources to make something look pretty, but not only is it something that's a valuable tool, but it's really well done and it's just easy to use from the little experience I have of it. Can you talk about maybe some success stories or some stories related to interactions that have happened on the platform?
Yeah. Well, thank you, first of all, for the compliments. They're much appreciated. But we also are open to constructive criticism as well. And, we do encourage that. It has to receive that too. But anyway, thank you for that positive feedback. With the whole bunch of things being facilitated. So, for example, we were contacted by a ranger in Sweden who said he wanted to set up, there wasn't an existing Swedish Ranger Association. He wanted to help us he wanted us to help him to set one up and connect us with the people inside the European Ranger Association and the IRF as well, who might be able to do that. So we were able to sort of facilitate that. And it's a big success because now it's growing and he's a great supporter of ours. So we're really happy with that. I think there are I mentioned some earlier stories about collaboration. So there have been some really interesting shared stories between Indian and Pakistani rangers across the border about vulture movement, and some incredibly moving stories about, from some rangers in Kenya who rescued a pregnant woman who had been mauled by an elephant out in the middle of nowhere, and they managed to rescue her and saved her and the child. So there was just like a really good story and stories of success, of counter-poaching success as well. But, we're really sensitive about security, both for rangers and the legal process. So we're really careful about some of those ones. But nonetheless, there's really important stories that should be shared. So we like those, but we're very careful with them. And I think there's almost nothing that gets more likes, in fact, than stories about successful seizures of ivory or contraband or illegal wildlife.
Yeah, it gives people a way to kind of cheer each other on, which is important, I think.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Do you have any stories, or have you heard from anyone? I think talking about the World Ranger Congress, one of the senses I got was that, some of these rangers, that it was their first Congress. For them, it was amazing to see that there's all this support outside of their country or their protected area. And I think one of the amazing possibilities for the app is to connect people that are in pretty remote places that might not have contact with other rangers or people on the outside. And sometimes, I've heard from even rangers in South Africa that say, it's great to see other people supporting us, because sometimes we're out here so many days on our own that you kind of forget that you're a part of something bigger, So I'm just curious if you have any stories or feedback of people saying that, this has been a way to connect, or maybe even just like observing it from the outside.
Yeah. Well, I think with the feedback we've had, a lot of the people we've been speaking to, and particularly recently, actually, where we've been getting much more detailed feedback, is about, we love the idea of being connected with this global community of rangers. I love seeing what someone in Argentina is doing or what someone in Bhutan is doing. That's fantastic. And it makes us all feel part of this. It's the camaraderie word again. But we've also heard a lot of people saying, that's a really nice to have. It makes me feel, warm inside. But the thing that helps me with my job is understanding what people in and around my protected area are doing, adjacent protected areas or adjacent landscapes, even, whether they're government or private, public or private. And that's something that we're hearing a lot of, actually, at the moment. A lot of people sort of saying, well, we're part of a conservancy association with 25 conservancies or 30 conservancies. And actually, we would like to connect with each other, not necessarily as an operational tool, but just so we actually know what we're all doing. We can share stories that perhaps aren't sensitive ones, but we can use it as a repository for documents that are relevant exclusively to our protected area. So this is another thing that the app is able to do. We can ring fence big chunks of it so that a particular group of conservancies or even ranger associations can actually just share information with their members only, and no one else outside can see that. But it's totally secure system. So that's a really good. I think that combination of local and global, which we hear in other contexts of life, is particularly strong here. So it has to be relevant. I think that's the key, as well as being a connector. It has to be relevant.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. From my time in South Africa, just working with some of the rangers there too, I think a lot of them had WhatsApp groups between different, connected reserves and Kruger National Park and those areas because, especially when it comes to poachings and things like that, to be able to communicate with each other and collaborate really makes a difference in what they can achieve.
Absolutely.
So yeah,
Yeah.
that's great that you can do that with the app as well. Talk about the training a little bit more. You said there's different types of training that rangers can have access to. What type of training? How do they access it? I don't know if you can go into a little bit of detail.
Yeah. So the training platform has got a variety of content, a wide variety. So you can initially there's a filter. So you can say, I would like to study Ranger Code of Conduct, or I would like to study health and safety, or I'd like to study wildfires or patrolling techniques. And so there's a drop down menu, and you can select which of those, and then up pop 6 or 8 different areas of content which are relevant to that, or and supplied by different providers. So some of them, the IUCN MOOC series, conservation MOOC series, are one of them, and of course that gets accredited, and it's highly regarded in terms of the content. But there are other sort of short things like aid memoirs. So someone in the field can, if they've got it on their phone anyway, they don't necessarily have to download it if they don't have connectivity. But they can check, okay, help, this is an field emergency, and here's what I need to do first aid. Okay, check these following things. Or collecting evidence, for example, is another good one in that area. So some of them are kind of much longer, and some of them are short. So the variety to meet different needs is really important. But we have just done a survey to ask rangers what the areas they're most interested in terms of training and learning. And a lot of it is the early feedback we're getting seems to be it is all about, well, for one, nothing is dominant. And I think that emphasizes the point that many rangers have 6 or 8 roles. A single individual has 6 or 8 roles. But of course, across the wider spectrum, rangers do a heck of a lot of things. So that was one bit of feedback. But as a result of that, almost the more generic the question we asked about which category they're interested in learning about, the more broad it was, the more sort of votes it got, because everyone it captured more of that breadth in many ways.
That makes sense. And I kind of want to talk about where you see this going a little more. But since we're on the topic of training, you said you worked with the Southern African Wildlife College a lot. Can you talk about that relationship, how you got connected to them originally? And, we're very, very involved with them as well with the film and partnerships and things like that. And they're doing amazing things. So just kind of curious from your side how you got connected and how that relationship has grown. Yeah,
so, the Peace Parks Foundation, who I mentioned earlier, are very closely aligned with them. They're almost sort of sister organizations. And so as a result of that, I went and visited there 7, 8 years ago, and like everybody who visits there was just blown away and majorly impressed with the people and the place and the outcomes. They're just incredible. So it made sense to work closely with them and try to find overlapping areas of interest. And so we're always looking at their learning materials and trying to integrate them where we can. We're always trying to see if there are ways that their graduating rangers can use the platform. And we're also speaking to them about many of the protected areas in their zone who are obviously interconnected with them around Kruger, and trying to understand if they can use the app and find it useful. So there's a whole stack of different ways of working together. And, even one of the key parts of our solution, which sort of goes right back to the beginning of the conversation about sponsorship and corporate partnerships. It's be an incredible place for corporate partners to be, to run events or visits or training. So we think there are a whole stack of things that we can do alongside them. But of course, all of those things are predicated on them being, best in class in the region.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is one of your big mission statements or goals on your website is, 1 million trained and equipped rangers by 2030, which kind of ties into the 30 by 30. But the Ranger app is a part of this, but what are kind of the ways you're going about trying to help achieve that goal?
Well, we've talked about the Ranger app. I think the other key, we have built a second app. And that's, while the Ranger app is all about a sort of inward looking inside the Ranger community, the second platform, which is called the Force for Nature pod, is all about connecting the rest of the world with Rangers, the outward facing bit. And it's a platform for aggregating the might of people who are interested in rangers and conservation, organizations and individuals, and aggregating that might and behind single campaigns so that everybody who gets involved in a campaign is a social media campaign is sharing the same content at the same time in the same way. And it's our strong belief that the history of conservation it's suffered, or the success of conservation has suffered, because historically conservation organizations have not always collaborated as best as they might. And so our view is that if we can create this, well, we have created this platform that can help people easily as a labor-saving device, plug in and play type solution, which can provide these single campaigns which everyone can get behind, which are non-controversial, which everyone can get behind, a message and a call to action, then we can make really big strides. And the content is, you mentioned our other content earlier, but we've created one early campaign and alongside with our advertising agency partners. And the content is, in my opinion, is really beautiful. And that's been shared, hundreds of thousands of times already. And we've got more campaigns coming up for World Ranger Day at the end of this, 11 days time at the end of this month. And we're hopeful of getting still more organizations and people to become citizen rangers and, do their bit, try and be active. So we're not sort of seeking funding through this platform. We're seeking ways to communicate the importance of rangers and the obstacles they face to the biggest possible audience. Now, that loops back around to your question in the sense that raising awareness of rangers is critical, because policymakers need to understand that basic metric, that there just aren't enough rangers and protected areas aren't well effectively managed, and rangers don't get the equipment and the training and the support they need. So put all those things into a pot, then action might be taken to increase the number of rangers and address some of the other issues. So we do believe that raising awareness as part of the solution, but we only believe in raising awareness when linked to a call to action. And that means getting people to act in concert with each other, not just being aware of something and doing nothing about it, but actually being aware and being given a simple way to do something about it, and not just give money, but actually act, either personally through sharing their social media or locally by supporting rangers or whatever. But there are lots of other things we're bringing into that. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, and connected to bringing awareness is part of this kind of, are you seeing this as a way to tell stories of some of these rangers? Because I think that's a big part of it is, I don't think a lot of people really have great context outside of, I think we get so steeped in the conservation world, being in it and working in it, but outside of it, I don't think that many people really understand what rangers are doing. So getting those stories out there and especially those like very human and touching stories, like that woman that you were talking about in Kenya that was saved, getting those out there. Is that a part of what you see the Force for Nature pod app as being able to do as well?
Absolutely. I mean, I couldn't have put it better. I think you're right. I mean, we have a lot of narrators of conservation, and often they are TV presenters, probably from, in many cases, Northern Hemisphere countries. In some senses, we want to try and change that so that the voice is an authentic local one in a local language, as well. And so I think that's a really important part, because it's much more engaging, and it comes back to that relevance question again. If, like I said, the combination of the global connectivity but with the local relevance it applies in this category as well. So I totally agree with you. In all cases, animals can't speak for themselves, right? So no matter how beautiful a TV show is shot, they can't necessarily tell they can't tell their own story. But in the case of rangers, they're the best sort of interconnector between those animals and those landscapes and those plant species and us, the average person on the street, and government and businesses and all the other parties who are interconnected with this stuff. So we think they're great storytellers for the things that matter.
Yeah, and I think we agree. I mean, there's a lot of people that really care about wildlife and, watch those shows that, like the Nat Geo shows that are super beautiful, and then they want to do something about it. But I think there's something to connecting with a human story that gets people beyond, your typical animal-loving conservationist group, if that makes sense. And, that's part of what we're trying to do with the film, and tell those stories from a very human side, even seeing, what their families and how they support them, as well as the tough things that they have to do out in the field, but also the amazing experiences and successes they have. So it's, it's a wide range of humanity experienced in probably some of the most amazing human beings I've met are rangers. And, I would any day would rather go out in the back of a truck with the rangers than like do a, standard guided tour. So
Yeah,
I
exactly.
think getting these stories out there is super important.
Absolutely.
Can you talk maybe a little more into the weeds with how the pod app works? You're talking about amplifying campaigns, but what do people do? Is it something that anyone can use, or is it specifically for people in the conservation space, or is it kind of developing?
Yeah, so the idea is anyone can go to the Android store and or the App Store and download the Force for Nature pod app. Then you sign up and anyone can review the materials of the latest or the upcoming campaign. And if they like those campaign materials and they believe they agree with the content of them, then they can just, with a few short presses of the button, which is explained on the platform, then they can just share that content through their own social media channels. And they can choose if they want to share them on all their social media channels or some of them or none of them. So that is the sort of the core of it. And what it does is it enables us to collect effective data on how effective the campaign has been. And it also provides us with, other opportunities to provide news updates to members of the pod. So there's a bunch of other things that it can do, which conventional social media does not do in that context. But the effect is magnified. So that's really how it works. But it's not complex. It's just the complex bit is getting lots of people to do the same thing at the same time. That's the complex bit. But but we've already seen that it does do that.
Yeah, and I've been on there, and I'm waiting until this episode comes out to kind of that same week we'll repost some of those campaigns. But it seemed like it was pretty turnkey. Like it made it super easy to just instantly basically post these images and content and everything over to your channel and make it as simple as possible. And I'm guessing it might be a good time too, because I feel like this is going to come out either the week before or after World Ranger Day. So if you guys are going to have a campaign out there, maybe that's a good time for people to check it out and see if those campaigns are something they feel passionate about reposting.
Yeah. Thanks, John. That's a good question. And so we're working with the Universal Ranger Support Alliance, which, I mentioned briefly earlier, but as some of your listeners may know, is made up of 7 initial, but now a further 7, including yourselves, members. And the idea is really that we've got these 14 organizations all working together in a very similar way to what I talked about. So, and some materials have been produced by the Rangers Support Alliance for World Ranger Day. And some of these will be shared through the Force for Nature pod. And we do have some financial incentives through this upcoming campaign, in that a partner has said they will donate funding to the International Ranger Federation, not to us, but the International Ranger Federation, if we hit certain targets. So if we hit, if the campaign hits 1 million people, there's a certain amount, and if the campaign hits 2 million people, then it's a certain amount more. So that's a really exciting innovation as well. So we're really hoping that everybody will join and participate, and get it going as far and wide as possible. And then who knows what happens after that? But it'd be really exciting. So yeah, those materials have been approved and agreed with all of the members of the Rangers Support Alliance. So yeah, that's where the value is. It's having this pre-agreed content, which is non-controversial, and there's no stepping on anyone else's toes, trying to access their members or partners. Everything is retained by the individual organization.
Yeah, looking forward to that one.
Yeah.
So we'll definitely share as much as we can on our end, and hope you hit those goals too, because I think that's a really exciting way to go about connecting partners with being able to raise funds for conservation. So
exactly.
Yeah, super exciting. What are you looking at moving into the future? I mean, you've got a lot going on at the moment, just kind of maintaining and upgrading and getting surveys of people. But what do you see in the next 1-2 years?
Well, there's 2 main products that I mentioned. So there's the Ranger app and the Force for Nature pod. The third sort of part of the strategy is a 3-legged stool, our strategy, which is meant to be very strong. But the third part of the strategy is our corporate partnership and corporate engagement piece, which we touched on at the beginning. And the idea really is that we're already well down the road, engaged with lots of partners. I mentioned one a few minutes ago. So we already have our first 2 or 3. And the idea really is that we build a series of benefits under a bespoke partnership program. So it's not about philanthropy. It's not about donations. It's about a win-win partnership between us and our partners, our conservation partners, and a corporate. And the idea is that we are offering those corporates unique access into protected areas, unique access to ambassador rangers, unique access to a whole host of eyeballs and media and marketing benefits that are linked to our brand. And so those are it's a really key part of what we're doing, because that is our business model. And our business model is to try and generate funding through that, and to grow it so that more and more funding can go back into ranges. I mentioned before, we're a social enterprise, so we're not for profit. And so that the purpose is really to drive that piece, because it's much more scalable. I mean, I think we all know we are hundreds of billions of dollars short a year on protected area management revenue for protected area management. And we have to find private capital solutions for that shortfall. And it ain't going to come from the conventional sources, although they're really valuable. I mean, I'm not knocking them, they're really valuable, but we have to find other sources. And there are lots of really fantastic financial innovations, or using financial instruments to generate revenue for conservation, which are somewhat nascent. And this is a somewhat nascent marketing innovation. So we're getting fantastic feedback, and we're speaking to lots of companies. We've got a great pipeline, and we're well on our way. But all of those things sort of fit into, those three products sort of fit into in conjunction with each other. And I know you've had some experience as well with GCC on engaging with corporates as well. So, you know about some of those areas, but It's not as easy or direct a fit as I first envisaged when I, talked about 20 years ago or whatever. I was like, oh, well, we can just take what we've done, what's happening in the sport, and just apply it over. It's so much more complex and nuanced to get it right. But the direction the world is moving means that, we're going to get there.
What do you think makes it so much more complex? Is it because of the nature of how the funds need to be used on the other side, or is it convincing corporate partners that this is, there's a way that they can get some benefits out of it, or have a good look, or learn something themselves? What are some of those challenges?
I think part of it is the culture, is cultural. So it's not just the culture, but of businesses and NGOs, for profit, not for profit, charity, whatever, which of course is important. It is a challenging cultural difference, but actually more and more we see people who have worked in one sector moving into the other sector and going in both directions. So that it's not sorted, but it's maybe better than it was. I think the second cultural thing is the idea that charitable entities have survived through philanthropy or grants or donations, whatever, for a very long period of time. And the modus operandi has been, we're doing something useful and good in the world, which most 99% are, and they receive money to do that, to do those things, and they produce a report at the end which tells the donor what a good job they've done. And to some extent, everyone's happy in that thing. And when you try and shape that model and you say, okay, well, we're going to do things differently here, you can get 10 times more money, but the overhead might be higher because you've got to deliver value back to the donor, or not the donor, but the corporate investor. Mm-hmm. And that means a lot of extra work delivering value back to the investor. But if the sum of money that coming in is $1 million, and you're spending 300,000 on delivering value and 700,000 on delivering impact on the ground, 700,000 on the impact on the ground, pretty damn good. If you're getting 100,000 and you're spending 90 on the ground and 10% on overhead, great. The ratios are really good, but 90 is a hell of a lot less than 700. So I think there's a cultural shift there, which is like understanding that delivering value can actually deliver scalability. And I think that is a challenge, which is one that we're addressing. We've addressed. But I think the final one comes from the other side. It's from the corporates. Often the decision makers in corporate businesses are, and indeed any walk of life, are quite conservative. Let's just do the thing we know and love. So let's keep sponsoring football because I won't lose my job if I sponsor football, and it's quite fun, whatever. But it takes brave organisations and brave people to take slightly different steps at a reasonable scale. And I'm grateful that we found some amazing people who are doing that. And, we hope there'll be a lot more. And I think it's really important that if we can forge some kind of a path through this difficult ground, that it helps benefit, and the model can be proven, then it's not just us who benefit, that it's everybody, that it's, you guys, and, as I said, I know you're already doing things with corporates, but, but that actually becomes a really well proven model. And I use this analogy quite regularly. We know that in 1960, the sports marketing industry sports sponsorship industry was worth almost zero. I mean, there was some ticket sales, but no sponsorship, no hospitality, nothing. And here we are, 60 years later, whatever, it's worth nearly $1 trillion a year. And so why can't we do the same thing? In half the time, why can't we do the same thing? And not get rid of the sport thing? That's great, but I'm not suggesting that. But as an allocation of capital, this is, delivers value in a broader sense. So I think it's, that's my hope, that's my dream in that particular sphere.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, I think that makes sense. It's probably partially just creating positions within some of these NGOs that focus on that value creation for, say, a corporate sponsor. I know with GCC, we've done with some of our corporate sponsors, we'll create, different types of video content for them that then they can show, like, here's what we're doing that's good with these, say, boots with Garmont or someone like that. So you have to find ways to actively create something that they can then go to the world with and say, hey, it's one thing when, you put your name on a NASCAR, the millions of people are going to see that on TV, but how are people going to see the good that these corporations are putting into these different efforts? So I think that's kind of a interesting way to go about it for sure.
I think it is. I mean, I'm working with some amazing sponsorship agency called iMedia, the network. They're sort of putting me through the ringer because I sort of say, oh, I know sponsorship, I used to sponsorship. And they say, okay, what's the offering? What's your sponsorship offering for Force of Nature? So I sort of produce my deck, and they're like, sponsorship's moved on a lot since you were last in it, pal. And, they're rigorously taking me through what are the benefits? How do you deliver them? What are they in detail? Is this just a sort of vague idea? No, I want to know what are the logistics? How many people how many people manage? So for all the 20 odd benefits that we're talking about, there's an incredibly detailed breakdown of value, because, that's what you've got to do to convince people that you are serious and you're not, and that is now what happens in the sports context. And they manage, some of the biggest sporting events in the world and some of the biggest sponsors of some of the biggest. So you've got to listen to them. You've got to take it on board. And actually, it's really been an education and to try and understand the level of rigor that we need to observe if we are to not just be a kind of philanthropy plus. If we're to be actually commercially viable proposition, we've got to be diving into the weeds and really pulling out value, and not just and you mentioned being in conservation. It's hard for us because we just assume that there is value here because we know there's value, we know it for a fact. Mm-hmm. But assuming that and knowing it isn't the same as convincing someone else that there's value for their business as well as for the wider world. So we have to work doubly hard, I think. That's always that's the message that I keep coming across in this is just when I think I've worked harder than I've ever worked on anything ever before, I realize, I got to work a bit harder to get this thing really steaming.
Yeah, I feel you on that one. It's every time you think you're at the end, you're just at another beginning.
Yeah. So. But that means progress, I guess, as well, right? We're making progress. So.
Exactly. Do you think part of this too is, I mean, how much have you thought about this as you're going about it? There's still always that danger of down the line that pleasing these potential corporate sponsors could start to take over the good that's being done, if that makes sense. Like, it's one thing to say we're going to 30% is going to that, and then the rest is going towards efforts, and we're raising way more money. But I could see like this kind of, I don't know if mission creep's the right word, but this, this kind of creep from one side taking over the other. I don't know if you were thinking about that and how, as you kind of build this new model out, how to kind of keep from allowing that to happen. Because I think that's part of maybe convincing other people to use this model too, is showing like, hey, there's a right way to go about it, and there are these dangers that could pop up. Just curious if you've thought much about that yet.
Yeah, I think we have thought about it a lot. I mean, one is just good governance. So, in our statutes and founding statutes, we talk about what the purpose of the organization is, and we have a board of directors who make damn sure that that's what we're pursuing. I think the second one is making sure that the corporate partners we work with have the highest standards already or are working towards them. But, we do a lot of due diligence. We don't want to work with anybody, not just because we're jolly good people, but, mainly because it's also self-interest for our bigger mission for Rangers, because we pick the wrong partner once, doesn't matter how much money they give us, it destroys the idea forevermore. So working with the right partners in the right way is absolutely critical. And so these are the last bit, in the right way. Do you allow, what happens if they get too powerful once they're already in? And I think there is a sort of twofold bit to that. One, governance, I already sort of mentioned, and our own staff and employees who just walk out the door if they feel that that's changing. But also on the other side, corporates, one of the reasons they would get involved with us is because we talk about, staff engagement, stakeholder engagement, and all behind this really rigorous measurement system that we've got as well, which does not enable greenwash to take place. We evaluate ourselves all the time, and we also evaluate their contribution to our impacts. So that really detailed, rigorous, and which is all externally verified as well. So internal verification is not going to wash in this context. So all of those things are so important, and they're hard, but they're really, really important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So why do you keep doing this? You were just kind of saying, there's all these challenges. You think you got something done, and you kind of got to keep pushing, or, why do you keep waking up every morning and going to work doing this work?
Well, it's easy enough, isn't it? I believe it's the right thing to do for morally. I think it's the right thing to do. I think it's the right thing to do for humanity and for nature. But mainly, I just love nature, and I just can't imagine not doing something like this or something like this. And even if I don't spend as much time in the field as I would like, it doesn't matter as much, because I'm dealing with the topic that I'm completely passionately obsessed about. And so that's a pretty easy answer. I think there's another bit, to be fair, which is like the intellectual puzzle. How do we solve these problems? And I'm pretty compelled by that as well. Maybe that's the thing I do when I'm at night. That's the thing I do, and I sort of lie awake thinking about how to solve the things. And in the day, it's all about the passion and excitement of it all. Yeah. So those are the sort of three sort of good reasons, really.
What kind of advice would you give someone that's thinking about going into this space and into conservation, supporting rangers, anything like this?
I would first of all say, weirdly, when I thought that everyone, when I used to be in Formula One, I used to get lots of people speaking to me and saying, "Oh, look, how do I get into Formula One? It's so cool." And then for about 15 years, no one ever asked me that question, which is great. I thought the world's moving on. But in the last 2 years, there's some Netflix show about Formula One, and lots
just started watching it.
Yeah, lots of my friends' kids are all saying, they're also, my friends are crawling out of the woodwork saying, my daughter or son would like to work in Formula One. How do they get it? And I'm like, I thought this was a sort of new era, and so I'm not sort of having courage. So the first thing I would say to them is, don't go into Formula One, go into conservation, and if they're going to come, when they're in conservation, I would tell them that it's worth it tenfold times over. Because of the satisfaction of even small gains. So I would say, and great people like your good self, John.
Yeah, thank you, Jamie. Same to you. Yeah, I feel like that's, for me, has been one of the biggest or most exciting parts of it, is just the people you get to work with. Especially the Rangers, like I said earlier, some of the most amazing humans I've ever met, and just to spend time with them and to talk with them and to eat with them and go out on drives with them. It's hard to beat.
I agree.
So if people want to get involved with Force for Nature, what can they do?
Well, the first thing I would invite them to do is to become a citizen ranger. So go to the Force for Nature pod and join our first campaign on World Ranger Day on the 31st of July this year, in a couple of weeks, and join the first campaign and join us on exciting roller coaster ride. That is one thing that we would love them to participate in. And to check out our socials at, the Force for Nature, and have a look at them, enjoy them. There's some great stuff. And you mentioned earlier on about the design, and we take real pride in creating really beautiful, accurate design specials on all our social media. So just go in and enjoy those and learn a bit more and see how you get on.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, there's so much good content out there. And yeah, this has been a real pleasure speaking with you, Jamie. Thank you for taking us through your journey and what you guys are doing at Force for Nature. It's really great stuff.
Thank you very much indeed, John. I've really enjoyed the conversation and hope the listeners did too.
Awesome. Thank you for listening to the Rhino Man podcast. If you enjoyed this episode and you're excited to see the film succeed, please subscribe and review our podcast on Spotify and iTunes. Then follow us on Instagram and Facebook at Rhino Man the Movie. More details about Rhino Man, the social impact campaign, and future screenings are at rhinomanthemovie.org. To learn more about the Global Conservation Corps and their work, visit globalconservationcorps.org. Sign up for the newsletter and follow GCC on all of the social platforms. If you like this podcast, make sure to subscribe and catch up on GCC's Voices of Nature podcast, where Bob Ludke interviews a wide range of people who have dedicated their lives to making a difference in conservation. A special thanks goes out to Simón Wilson for the music for this podcast. He's the brilliant composer for Rhino Man the Movie. Learn more about his work at simonwilsonmusic.com. Until next time, I'm John Jerko, and this is the Rhino Man Podcast.